Well, hello again, all you soil lovers out there. This is Averill from the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, continuing with the presentation to help Envirothon folks prepare for the soils part of the big event. We just talked about soil parent material and how important that is from the perspective of soil characteristics and permeability and lots of properties that can affect the nature of the soil as well as how the soil behaves. Well, let's talk about what happens next. This is a very brief overview of soil formation, what I'd like to call the ABCs of soils, and you'll see why we call that the ABCs of soils in just a moment here. Here's a depiction of a soil profile that has undergone formation processes and formed layers called horizons. And you'll see these labels, O, A, B, and C. And those depict some pretty typical layers that you're going to see or horizons that you're going to see out there in the field. So what are these different horizons? There are more of them than just O, A, B, and C, and we'll cover that. But this is just a typical scenario, and you're going to see these in lots of textbooks and whatnot. Please bear in mind that not all soils have all of these horizons, and there may not necessarily be in this order. There are exceptions to the typical scenarios. However, in undisturbed soils, so that is that they're not being plowed every year because of agriculture or what have you, and in typical Massachusetts wooded scenarios where the land has been in woodland for a significant period of time, there's organic material on the surface of the soil, on the upper part of the soil, that has undergone various degrees of decomposition. If it's primarily organic material, that is, that it's at least 20% organic material, that's more or less the number that we're dealing with. And that's by weight, and that's dry weight. So keep in mind that the 20% of the weight of the whole soil that in dry weight, that's a significant amount of organic material. Think about organic material has much lower bulk density than a sand grain. So 20% is kind of a lot. So a soil that is predominantly organic material, I'm sorry, a horizon that's predominantly organic material is an O horizon. A horizon that is predominantly mineral material with an accumulation of organic material is an A horizon. And a B horizon is a weathered layer. And the C horizon, or the C layer, if you will, is the relatively unaltered parent material, which we talked about at great length in the last presentation. So let's go into a little bit more detail with that. So organic matter, right? The O horizon is predominantly organic matter. And again, well, how do you tell the difference between O horizon and how do you know it's organic material? At 20% by weight is a lot of organic material. You may see, if it's not really well decomposed, you may actually see plant fibers in the material. And I also have to caution you that live roots don't count as part of the O horizon. This is the material that has undergone various stages of decomposition. If it hasn't gone through much decomposition, you're going to see plant fibers. You may even be able to identify the source of the plant fiber. Is it leaf fiber? Is it bark fiber? Or if it's better decomposed, it's going to typically be very dark. If you wet it and you rub it between your finger and your thumb, it's going to feel very greasy. It's got a very slick feel to it. If you can get enough of it and get it good and wet and you squeeze it in your hand, it's not going to have a lot of strength. You're going to be able to squeeze some of that through your fingers. Also, organic material will maintain its color, whether it's wet or dry. So if you take that material and you dry it out and make note of it, if it dries to a much lighter color, chances are it is mineral material. Because mineral material, even if it's darkened by organic matter, will become brighter upon drying. So speaking of which, the A horizon is a mineral layer that has received an accumulation of organic material. And this tends to be the most highly decomposed uh, form of organic material. It doesn't take a lot of organic material to change the color of the mineral layer. So if you're looking at the soil profile sequence and you see this darker layer and it doesn't feel real greasy, and you see that compared to what's immediately underlying it, it's much darker, than think A horizon. And as a rule of thumb, it's probably better to think A horizon before you think O horizon, because again, it's people are easily misled by this, because knowing that organic material is dark and seeing that dark layer, people jump to the conclusion that the A horizon is an O horizon. And it's get your hands dirty and feel that material and compare it to what's immediately underneath it. The B horizon. This is, picture, if you will, the parent material, and weathering forces start to act on it. And there's freezing and thawing, and there's biological and chemical processes that start to affect it. In Massachusetts, probably the most prevalent form of alteration is simply the oxidation of iron that changes the color of the material to a yellowish brown or reddish brown color. Or you might see the formation of structure, which I think I talked a little bit about in the last presentation. But you'll see that it's different from the underlying parent material. Now that said, there's an exception to every rule. Not always does every B horizon immediately overlie the underlying immediately overlie the parent material. The C layer or C horizon is a relatively unweathered parent material. That is the stuff that we talked about in the first presentation, where glacial deposits, floodplain deposits, windblown deposits have just been deposited, and they have not undergone these weathering processes. So it's sort of in the same condition that it was in when it was first deposited. Now, so the C is the relatively unweathered geologic material. There are a couple of other layers that you need to know about. One is called the E horizon, the zone of eluviation. What does eluviation mean? That means that something has exited. Think of E as exiting. This is a layer, it's usually close to the surface, where material has been removed, specifically the coloring agents that you would typically find in a different type of horizon. So what are the primary coloring agents? So the most influential coloring agents in soils. Organic matter is one. As I mentioned before, it doesn't take a lot of organic material to change the color of the mineral layer. The other one is iron, and iron is very prevalent throughout the planet, throughout soils. And under aerobic conditions, under aerated conditions, when soil gets wet, the iron can oxidize. It's a rusting, essentially. So that's where you get the color of your typical B horizons. So those two coloring agents can be leached from a layer and removed from that layer and deposited further below. And how that happens is that it takes certain circumstances. You need moist conditions because it takes water to percolate down through the soil profile. And it also takes a source of acidic solution. So in Massachusetts, where you're going to find these things typically are in the higher, cooler elevations under pine trees or hemlock trees, or in some cases, spruce, the needles of which all add acids to the soil, so that when snow melt and precipitate and rain filters down, infiltrates, and percolates down through the soil. It picks up these acids. It removes the coloring agents from the individual soil particles. The individual sand grains, the individual silt grains lose their coloring agents. They lose their organic layers or their iron oxide layers, and that gets removed from the E horizon and deposited further below. We'll show you a picture of an E horizon later. Then there's the R. That's the bedrock. The R layer is the unconsolidated bedrock that you may or may not encounter in a soil profile. Some deposits in Massachusetts are many, many tens of or hundreds of feet thick, and you don't encounter the bedrock. In other places, the bedrock is very close to the surface. So here's a soil profile. What are the horizons that you see? How many horizons do you see in this soil profile? Well, I guess it sort of depends on whether you're a lumper or a splitter, but the surface, dark surface layer is pretty distinct. I think most people would agree that there's a separate layer there. It's a little darker immediately underneath. It transitions to a fairly uniform, yellowish brown, reddish brown color, and then there's a transition down to the gray color. So this grayer color is the relatively unaltered geologic material. In this case, it's a lodgement till. Above that is the B horizon, and some people would split out in more than one B horizon, and that's fine. Above that, is that an O horizon or is it an A horizon? Not a fair question to ask from looking at a picture, but typically, knowing, again, you need to get take a look around you at the WHOLE. This is a lawn situation. It's a park or something. There are trees, but it's not forested. This was probably plowed at one time. The chances are this lacks an O horizon. So this is an A horizon in a well-drained, high and dry scenario. Even in the woodland, the O horizon is probably not going to be more than 2 inches thick. So this is a pretty simple A, B, C scenario on this profile. How about this one? You see this ashy color? This is a very good example of an E horizon. So this is actually up in the White Mountains where the climate is cool, the growing season is short, and there's a lot more water going down through the soil profile as compared to warmer areas with longer growing seasons and more water coming out of the soil than going in during the growing seasons and so on and so forth. So acids are picked up by the coniferous vegetation. They percolate down through the soil. They remove the coloring agents from this layer or this horizon, and they deposit it immediately below in this horizon. There's no O horizon in this particular profile. This is an O horizon immediately underlain by a different O horizon. How is it different? In this horizon, the organic matter is better or at a greater stage of decomposition. So this is minimally decomposed, and this is well decomposed. Underlain by the E horizon, underlain by the B horizon. You could actually split out a couple of B horizons here. You see one of them has more organic in it, and the other one more iron, underlain by the C. So in this particular profile, you have an O, A, B, C. How about this one? It's pretty distinct change down here. Well, what's going on with this one? This one actually is two different parent materials. This is windblown aeolian deposition overlying a coarse glaciofluvial deposition, coarse textured glaciofluvial. So if you sort of ignore this, You can see there's a thick A horizon. There might be an O horizon on the very surface here of slightly decomposed organic material. An A horizon, this was definitely plowed. You can see it has an abrupt, clear boundary that is indicative of the plow depth. This looks like a pretty good agricultural soil. It's fairly level. And this is you have the B horizon, fairly distinctive here, underlain by C material, or maybe this is B also, because you see how it gets grayer here. This is just maybe not as well weathered. Underlain by a different type of parent material. So even though this is brighter and it looks more oxidized, it's not related to what's above. A, B, you can even go down to B to here, C, and another C. Well, we would call it a 2C because it represents a discontinuity in the deposition. How about this one? This particular profile, and this looks, you can see the fibers in this. This looks like a pretty well expressed O horizon here. This is the A horizon right along here. You can see it's a darker layer. It's a mineral layer with an accumulation of organic, which makes it darker. This is the B, and it grades. You could split out a couple of Bs if you want to, and it grades down to the relatively unweathered parent material here. So in this case, this is a forested soil. So the leaf litter and whatnot have been accumulating for a long period of time. O, A, B, C. What's going on with this one? Got a dark, thick, dark surface layer underlain by gray and orangey, reddish, brownish colors. What is going on with this? Well, let's talk about that. This is a nice segue into the concept of drainage class. And if you think back, this was one of the concepts that you need to know about when you get involved with the Envirothon. You look at this landscape photo. You see hillsides surrounding a basin, level basin. So you can imagine the soil-water relationship is much different than the soil-water relationship here. This is a wetland, and this is going to receive water. This is going to shed water. So you can imagine that the amount of saturation in this soil is going to be much different. The length and duration are kind of the same thing, right? The duration and the amount of saturation, the depth from the surface to saturated conditions is going to be different from this soil to this soil. Let's talk about it a little bit more. Two soil profiles. Now remember, we just talked about parent material, and we've talked about horizons, and now let's get into this a little bit more from the perspective of soil-water relationships and drainage class. Both of these are A, B, C soil profiles. Both of these soils formed in lodgement till. Both of these soils have been forming for the same amount of time since the last glaciation. Both have formed under the same climatic conditions in more or less the same biological conditions. So I've just named all the soil forming factors except one. So what do you see here that is different between the two? Yes, the profile on the left has a little bit of a darker A horizon profile, and the B horizon is thicker than on the one on the right. But there's a big difference here that you see here that you don't see here. You see these orangey and gray colors intermingled together. There's a little bit of orangey colors here. They're a little bit deeper, and I apologize because this measure is in English units, and this measure is in metric units. Do the conversion. How about this one? Well, let me go back. Sorry. So I need to talk a little bit about why this happens, right? What's the difference is we said the climate is the climatic conditions are the same. The amount of time soil forming is the same. The parent material is the same. And the biota or organisms are more or less the same. Yet this morphology is distinctively different just above the dense layer than here, right? In this one, you get the dark surface over these orangey and gray colors. So what's happening with this? This soil will perch water because it's got a dense layer. This soil will perch water because it's got a dense layer. This soil will perch water because it's got a dense layer. The difference is the position in the landscape. This soil is on a high position in the landscape where water is going to be shed. This soil is on a bench in the landscape where water is going to be retained in that soil before it has the ability or the chance to drain off. This soil is in a depression in the landscape where it is subject to water being fed into that landscape position or landform position is probably more accurate to say. It's as a result, it's going to remain wetter longer than the other two soils. So again, take a look around you. Look at the WHOLE and not just the HOLE. Look at the whole and not just the whole. Where on this map would you expect to find these three soils? This particular soil is going to be on a side slope. This particular soil is going to be on a bench in the slope or on a foot slope or a toe slope, and this one will be in a depression. Everything's the same but the landscape position. So you can kind of get the concept of these soils that formed in lodgement till. Their soil-water relationship, or how the depth of the seasonal high water table and how long they're going to be saturated is based on not only their physical makeup, but their position in the landscape. Is water going to shed from that position, or is it going to be, or is water going to be is going to flow to that position? How about these two soils? These soils developed in the same parent material, sandy glacial fluvial deposition. This is well sorted sand. Right? These are medium sands throughout both soil profile. But you see in this soil, these orange colors, these blotches of orange, and these blotches of gray colors. What's going on with these soils? Well, this soil, even though it's highly permeable and water and air move through them quite readily, this soil is in a lower lying position in the landscape where the actual groundwater rises to within this distance, at this depth from the surface. Whereas this soil is in a high position on the landscape and is not subjected to seasonal saturation. Soil is high and dry. The soil is in a low-lying position. So what happens is that in a nutshell, the seasonal high water table in soils leaves a bathtub ring. It rises up in the spring, and if it's warm enough, long enough, then the microorganisms that live in the soil, they eat the carbon, respire in the soil. If it's under saturated conditions, through their respiration, they will remove. They need oxygen to live, so they remove oxygen from the water itself, the dissolved oxygen in the water. When they run out of that, they've got to find oxygen somewhere else. So they remove the oxygen from the iron that's in the soil. The iron the iron changes its electrical charge, and it no longer adheres to the individual soil particles. So the color you see here and the color you see here is the result of iron oxides coating the individual soil particles. Under saturated anaerobic conditions, those iron oxides change their electrical charge. They no longer adhere to the individual soil particles, and they go into solution in that water environment, in that saturated environment. Water table will drop down typically every spring when plants start to grow and they start to remove water out of the ground and evapotranspire it into the air. The water table will drop. And when the table drops, the iron that is held in solution in that water will be exposed to air and will precipitate out as iron oxides. Cool? So what we have here are these morphological features in soils that we call redoxymorphic features. And redoxymorphic refers to the reduction and oxidation of elements in the soil, predominantly iron, but it happens with manganese and other elements as well. So the gray colors are areas where the iron's been removed from the individual soil particles, and the reddish brown colors or the yellowish brown colors or these concentrations of colors are where the iron has precipitated out and recoated those individual soil particles. This particular slide, you can actually see some orangey colors in this thick, dark A horizon. If you can see redoxymorphic features in this material, that's pretty wet soil because the iron will tend to mask all the other colors in the soil. You see, as you go deeper, you're seeing these iron precipitates. We call these, and I can't remember now, iron concentrations of iron in the soil. And as you go deeper, you're going to see it gets grayer. And that makes perfect sense because the deeper you go in a wet soil, wetter it is longer, and you'll see morphology that is indicative of longer periods of anaerobic conditions as compared to when you get up a little higher and the water table's fluctuating and the iron oxides have an opportunity to show their stuff. So it was just another shot. And this is pretty typical of redoxymorphic features. Here's where the iron's been reduced, where the iron is depleted, immediately surrounded by where it's precipitated out, and that's pretty common to see that, where they're associated with one another. The depletion and the concentration are associated with one another. This is a rule of thumb chart to help people just kind of understand what the concept of drainage class is. This isn't set in stone. This is something I put together to help people. You'll see different locations in different parts of the. In general, drainage class is a way to describe the depth to the seasonal high water table and how long the soil undergoes saturated conditions, if at all. So it's just a way to express sort of the relative wetness and the soil water relationships in the soil. So if you encounter a soil, you dig a hole in the soil, and even if it's a dry, droughty time of the year, and you're finding redoxymorphic features within 6 inches or a very thick, dark organic layer at the surface due to wetness, and again, you've got to look around. You've got to ask yourself: Is this organic because of thick leaf litter that hasn't, it's still undergoing decomposition? Or is it thick because it undergoes anaerobic conditions? And you can tell that by looking around you, seeing what's growing there too. If you've got those situations, you might say that that's a very poorly drained soil. You see these redoxymorphic features between an inch, a half a foot and a foot. You're dealing with a poorly drained soil. Foot to a foot and a half, a somewhat poorly drained soil, and so forth. When you get into scenarios where it's shallow to bedrock, say by shallow to bedrock, we typically mean within 20 inches to bedrock. And it's got a loamy surface, and we would say it's somewhat excessively drained. If it's sandy and gravelly throughout, and there's no indication of that bathtub ring left by the seasonal high water table, and throwing in greater than 5 feet here because in the soils work that the USDA does, we typically don't make interpretations beyond 5 feet or deeper than 5 feet. Sandy and gravelly, highly permeable soils on high positions in the landscape are referred to as excessively drained. These are very droughty soils. They don't hold water well at all, and it's tough to grow things in them for that reason. Again, it's a rule of thumb. Looking at this picture right here, how many different drainage classes do you see? How many different soil types do you see? I think it's reasonable. You could definitely come up with 4. There's a hillside where water's going to drain off of it. It might have a dense layer in it, and it might be moderately well drained. It might be excessively drained. It depends on what the makeup of the soil morphology is, physical characteristics of the soil. You can see in the foreground that there's water at the surface. This is a wet soil, right? I mean, we've got water at or near the surface. And granted, this is either the spring or the fall of the year, so we might not be in the growing season, and that makes a difference. I always put the caveat on growing season because in order for redoxymorphic features to form, the soil has to be warm enough for microbes to respire. So sometimes you can have a pretty wet soil and not see redoxymorphic features because it's only wet during the cold time of the year. Anyway, well or moderately well drained, somewhat poorly or moderately well drained here, certainly wetter than here, not as wet as here. This is the wettest. So you might, without actually looking at the soil, you might take a guess that this soil is very poorly drained. This soil is poorly drained. This soil is somewhat poorly drained to moderately well drained. This soil is well drained to somewhat excessively drained. Soil landform relationships. You can make a lot of really cool predictions about what's going on with the land with that knowledge. Okay, so we talked about soil drainage class. We talked about horizonation. I want to talk a little bit about soil structure and just to introduce you to the concept of it. Soils can form these individual aggregates with planes of weakness in between them through physical and chemical and biological alterations. Microorganisms and macroorganisms in the soil sort of can form a glue in the soil to help form these structural units. We call those units PEDs, by the way. And structure is important because it helps with water infiltration, water permeability throughout the soil profile, as well as creating a place for roots to grow more readily and homes for critters. And it enhances the ecosystem of the soil. So that's structure. And I already talked about consistence a little bit in the first presentation, but just to reiterate here, consistence is essentially the resistance of the soil to being broken up. How strong is it? How much stress can it withstand before it breaks up? So if you pull one of those PEDs out and you put it between your finger and your thumb and you squeeze it together, and it crushes with very little force. We refer to that as very friable. Takes a little more force, it would be friable. Here's where it gets kind of important, I think, especially in the soils of Massachusetts. If you're dealing with a dense layer with lodgement till, you're starting to get into this type of consistence. For the environment, you don't need to know all of this. The important thing to know is that consistence relates to how well water and roots can move down through the soil. When you start to get into a firm, very firm, extremely firm consistence, that becomes difficult for roots to penetrate and it becomes difficult for water to move through it. And the best way to learn about this stuff is really to dig holes. This is just an example of a soil profile. These were like, I don't know, 6 or 7 inch spike nails, and they had to be hammered in the side of the profile to get in there. Soil depth is another thing to think about when you're considering land use decisions and managing the land. Depth to bedrock or depth to an impermeable layer has restrictions on what you can do with the land, as well as when planning the land for a broader purpose, such as within a watershed. It becomes important to know what the characteristics of the soil are within that watershed. And that leads us into this concept a little bit of soil interpretations. A soil interpretation is simply a rating or a ranking, if you will, or a prediction of what that soil will, how well that soil will function under any given land use or land management scenario. That's what a soil interpretation is. And the reason we talk about this is that, you just learned about parent material and soil formation and the soil water relationships. All of those things come into play when it comes to making predictions about how the soil will behave under various land use scenarios. And so we can provide, based on all that information that we have about soils, we can provide common interpretations for things like farmland. What soils make the best farmland? What soils are best suited for a house with a basement, for example? What soils are best suited for treating wastewater from individual homes? And by the way, a lot of homes in Massachusetts use on-site sewage disposal systems, quite a few. So just for an example, what are we looking for soils that are suited for agriculture? We want loamy textures, dark surface layers, good tops, dark loamy topsoil. That's indicative of good water holding capacity as well as a high organic matter content. You don't want large stones and boulders. You don't want a seasonal high water table during the growing season because you're not going to be able to grow anything, nor are you going to be able to work the land. And if it's too steep, you're going to have issues with erosion potentially, as well as just it's more difficult to work the land. Unfortunately, all of these features that make land good for farmland are also those same features that make, at least to some extent, make it good developing land for homes and things like that. So farmland, there's competition between, we all need to live somewhere, but we also need to eat. So that's something to think about. How about the houses you live in? What soils are best for those? Certainly not ones in a floodplain. Certainly not those that if you're seeing redoxymorphic features within 3 or 4 feet, that's probably not a good place to put a house with a basement. You want to stay, and keep a good distance from any wet situation, and a very deep soil, so you're not blasting bedrock to put your cellar in. And it's better to have more level land. Again, competition with farmland. And septic systems require very specific scenarios in order to function correctly. So, from the toilet water and from the sink, that material and water goes into a septic tank. The solids sink down to the bottom. And once that septic tank fills up, there's an overflow of what's referred to as gray water that goes into the leach field. And you can see that this is not a very good place for a leach field because you don't want to put that effluent right into the groundwater. So you want, and matter of fact, in Massachusetts, the interpretation of redoxymorphic features is what is used to cite on-site sewage disposal systems. I want to talk a little bit about erodibility. When we use the land for agriculture or we develop the land and strip the vegetation off of it to put in buildings and so forth, we need to be very concerned about erosion. And some soils are more readily erodible than others. But what happens is the force of the rain hits the soil, and if the soil is easily transported or easily detached from the individual soil particles can be broken up from one another, then they can start to get moved. And as the water moves over the land, that those soil particles become transported and deposited somewhere else. On farmland, if there's herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers attached to that soil, what happens to it? It moves off the land and it's deposited somewhere else. Certainly a concern. And it has the effect of a snowball effect. Erosion does. And you can see here's where the material has been deposited, and you can see the gully that's been formed here. Why is that a big deal? Because it affects, firstly, it reduces our productivity. The soil that gets lost is almost always more valuable than that which is underneath it, because it takes time to build up that organic matter in the surface of the soil. And that's where all the good stuff is. Because with organic matter, you have better water holding capacity, nutrient recycling, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens to that material? Eventually it ends up in, or can end up in our waterways. Here is, this was in 2008, 1 week after Hurricane Irene. You can see that that's the mouth of the Connecticut River, and all of that sediment that got washed from the watershed in that hurricane down into Long Island Sound. Not a good thing. So what do we do to minimize erosion? Maintain vegetative cover, maintain a variety of plants. They interact with one another. There was always this theory that you got to get rid of all the weeds. Well, look at a forest. Look at a natural community. There are plants that are very different from one another, from the herbaceous stage to the shrub stage to the tree size. They're different and they do just fine with one another. Minimize disturbance, right? You want to maintain the cover, minimize disturbance, and manage to maximize organic matter. That creates well-developed soil structure and aggregate stability, which minimizes erosion and has a lot of other great benefits. And this is all rotates around organic matter, around carbon. And this is important. And when you look at the environment from the perspective of the current issue and so forth, soils can almost always name a current issue: water quality, wetlands, climate change. Soils are integral to all of those things. Soils are forestry. You don't have forests without soils. Wildlife needs plants for habitat, and without the soil, you don't have the plants. So these things are all interchangeable. Water, of course, aquatics. Soils are a filter for water, and it's the carbon in the soil that is key to filtering water. So it's all interchangeable. It's all something to think about when you are involved with the Envirothon as you get into this. This is just an example of within a watershed, broader land use planning. This depicts a dairy farm with animals creating a lot of manure. You've got individual homes here with septic systems. Perhaps up in the background here, shallow soils, shallow to bedrock that aren't going to hold a lot of water or not going to be able to treat water. So when we're thinking about what happens within a watershed and the quality of the water and what is being introduced into that and how the soils have an effect, what properties do the soils have that affect all of these things? Runoff, how quickly does it run off? How well does water infiltrate? What's the storage capacity of the soil? Depth to bedrock, the permeability and the consistency and the texture, all these things that you've learned about and organic matter content all affect the storage capacity and runoff rate within a watershed. Again, just an example of how soil characteristics can affect how the considerations that people ought to be thinking about when they plan things. Okay, so just to kind of try to wrap this up a little bit now. How do you prepare for the Envirothon? What's the best way to do that? Well, you have a manual. You should read the manual. You should focus on the key concepts at the beginning of the manual. Best way to prepare for the Envirothon is to go out and dig holes. In the manual, there's this thing called a soil evaluation exercise. And it asks you to do things like look at the WHOLE, look around you. What sort of a landform are you in? Are you on a floodplain? Are you on a drumlin? Then you dig a hole and you describe the soil. And from a 0 to 5-inch depth, what horizon is there, etc. And you recognize the different layers or horizons in the soils. And you've got a common column here for RMFs. That's redoxymorphic features, right? Identify the parent material. Are you shallow to bedrock? Well, what's the depth? And then you take all of that information that you've observed and you apply it to different land uses and to you identify the limitations and the suitability of the soil for those land uses. By the way, I'm pretty sure that the National Envirothon, it's the soils section is referred to as soils and land use, or at least it has in some years. This is what we mean by land use. You apply what you know about the soil to a practical purpose. You can go to a website called Web Soil Survey. If you Google Web Soil Survey, that will be the first hit you see. Learn to use the Web Soil Survey. And check it out before you go out into the field to learn about soils. Look at the soil map. When you go out around your school or whatever, wherever you can find a place to access relatively undisturbed ground. And by the undisturbed, I mean plowing is okay, but I realize that this might be a challenge for teams from more urban areas. But finding a place where you can dig a hole where the soil hasn't been cut or filled, where it hasn't been scraped or in a building, because of building development or so forth. But the edge of a cemetery, I know that sounds a little weird when you go to a cemetery with shovels in your hand. And of course, you need to get permission for all of this. But an area that's been wooded for a long time and hasn't been disturbed, if you can get out and dig a hole, and granted, it's hard work. You have to cut through the root mat and so forth to be able to see the soil profile. So that's the best way to learn. And if you consult the soil survey, you can learn what to expect to find. So, for example, if you were to dig a hole in this area where it says 31A, this is the soil type, and that soil type is called Walpole, which is neither here nor there. It doesn't really matter what we call it. What does matter is you have information about what you can expect to find there. What's the parent material? Sandy glacial fluvial deposits, right? What's the depth to the seasonal to the water table? About 0 to 4 inches. You may dig a hole, and you're not necessarily going to find the water table within 4 inches, but you could expect to find redoxymorphic features or a thick organic layer where it's indicative of wet conditions. So, learn about what you're going to investigate by consulting with a wet soil survey. Here's that same map. You can use the web soil survey to look at interpretations. This is an interpretation for important farmland. And what this is telling you is that the colors in green are prime farmland. Colors in red are farmland. The colors in blue are farmland of statewide importance. Colors in red are not important farmland. What if you were asked for the Envirothon to interpret some land and you were given a scenario where a farmer was going to grow a crop where there was going to need to be a lot of pesticide application. You could look for the interpretation for that for web soil survey. And this gives you different ratings for what the issues are for applying pesticides for the runoff potential, and where's that going to end up, right? In your watershed, or I'm sorry, in your waterways. So I've got 2 more slides left. Thank you for your patience in going through this. This is it's a long thing to have to sit through, I think. But again, focus on the key concepts: soil formation, the ABCs of soils, different soil properties, texture, redoxymorphic features, consistence, and get familiar with how to apply that information with soil interpretations. And the best way to learn about soils is to go out and dig holes. Use the web soil survey as a guide, and use the soil evaluation activity in your manual. And the last thing I want to leave you folks with is wishing you the best of luck with the Envirothon. It's a great activity to be involved with. It's a great program, and I wish you all the best.